Thank you all for coming. Just first an apology, my first language is not English. So when I speak English, I need to concentrate more, and I get this really grumpy look on my face when I do that. So apologies for that. It's not a good thing when you're working with happiness research. Also, sometimes there are misunderstandings because of my English. Last month, or in September, I was in London and doing an interview on live television, a national show in the UK, and the host, he was talking about the books, the little book of Lykke, the little book of hygge, and I wanted to compliment him on his Danish. And in Denmark, we've had this TV drama, political drama called Borgen, or Borgen, as they say in the UK. But anyways, on live TV, I said to him, well done on pronouncing Danish. You must have been watching a lot of Danish Borgen. But what he heard, you know what he heard. So if there are some things that's unclear, just raise your hand and we'll take care of it right away. Otherwise, there's time for questions afterwards. So basically my career and the work we do at the Happiness Research Institute is trying to answer three relatively complex questions. So we're trying to figure out how we can measure happiness, why some people are happier than others, and how can we improve quality of life. It's also the reason why I'm going slowly gray. It's quite difficult questions, but I think we are getting some answers. And we work for governments, we work for cities, we work for companies, we work for foundations, trying to shed some light on these different questions. It's also these questions I'd like to cover. I'll talk for about 30-35 minutes or so. But I actually also would like to talk a little bit about the political context for all this work. I should probably also say that when people hear that I work with happiness research, they imagine our office looks somewhat like this, and we have this room full of puppies and ice cream, and that's unfortunately not the case. It looks more like this. So basically, we're a group of people sitting in front of computers all day looking at numbers. So we try to find evidence, we try to find data that helps us understand and answer these three questions I talked about before. Can you see all right if I stand here? Okay, very good. So just a few words about the sort of political context for all these things. For us at the Happiness Research Institute, these are quite exciting times. In 2011, the United Nations passed a happiness resolution, which essentially asks all the countries of the world to focus more on happiness and see what they can do in order to improve quality of life. It's also the UN that commissions the World Happiness Report, where Denmark usually does quite well. We'll get back to that later on. But the inspiration for these things actually comes from a small country in the eastern Himalayas. How many of you have heard of Bhutan? You have. A few of you. Okay, so for those of you that haven't, what is special about Bhutan is that since the beginning of the 70s, they have focused on and navigated from something they call gross national happiness. So instead of looking at gross national product, are we getting richer? They are looking at, are we getting happier? And every political decision is based on, is this going to improve quality of life for people or not? And it's Bhutan that have put happiness on the agenda for the UN. So one of the most recent developments in terms of countries that have started to focus on happiness and well-being is the United Arab Emirates. Their official goal now is to become one of the 5 happiest countries by 2021. So last year, Uhud here was appointed Minister of State for Happiness, and it's her job to improve quality of life in the Emirates. She and I, we usually battle over who has the coolest job title, I think she wins, but I like to think of myself as a close second. Obviously, the Emirates have issues with big differences between levels of well-being. There's a high level of inequality in well-being in the countries, but they're seen to improve that. One of my main challenges is, of course, to try and figure out how do we quantify these subjective, intangible things. How do we quantify well-being, happiness, quality of life? All of those concepts are wide concepts. They are what we call umbrella terms. So what we do with all these terms is we essentially break them down and look at different components. So we look at usually 3 different components, and we do that because it gives us a better ability to understand happiness. And it's also the same thing we do when we stumble upon other complex umbrella terms. If we talked about the Danish or the Canadian economy, we could break that down and talk about unemployment, interest rates, growth, GDP, and so on. And that gives us an ability and a language to talk about how is the Canadian economy doing. And that's the same thing we need to do with happiness. So we look at 3 overall dimensions. The first dimension we always include in our studies is called life evaluation. And that is essentially just having people taking a step back and evaluating their lives. So considering the worst possible life they could lead and the best possible life they could lead on a scale from 0 to 10, where do they feel they stand right now? That's the metric that is usually fed into the World Happiness Report. It's also a very stable measure. So people answer the same today as they did 2 weeks ago. And that is different to the second dimension, which we call the affective dimension. That is much more about what kind of emotions we experience on a daily basis, both positive and negative emotions. So we ask people at a specific point of time, now or yesterday, did you feel happy, lonely, sad, depressed, worried, stressed, and so on? And that is very volatile. We can see there is a weekend effect on that dimension. We also have some quite interesting data on that dimension. So there's a study under the London School of Economics that have people download an app and then several times a day ask them, how happy are you? Where are you? Who are you with? What are you doing? I actually had an ex-girlfriend who used to text me the same things. But the thing here is, we now then have data under what circumstances are people more or less happy. And we can see when people are hiking, when people are in the countryside, they're happier than when they are in the cities. We can also see being home ill is the least happy activity. Work, unfortunately, is the second least happy activity. And no big surprise, if you look at the UK last year, the happiest day was Christmas Day. Bringing people together, food, family, good stuff. Any guesses on what the unhappiest day was last year in the UK? Valentine's Day? Brexit. Brexit is, I mean, it's a good bet for some, it was, but for the majority of population, they were actually happy with the decision. No, the unhappiest day was November 9th, when we woke up and Trump was president. And I think it's, to me, it's super interesting that we can see the impact of political events in the data like this. But so yes, this is very volatile. But of course, those 2 dimensions are linked. If you have an everyday with a lot of positive emotions, you probably also report higher levels of life satisfaction. The last dimension we always include builds on Aristotle's perception of happiness, and he thought the good life was the meaningful life. So here we are asking whether people have a sense of purpose. And we call it the Eudaimonic dimension because that was the ancient Greek word for happiness. And for example, on that dimension, we can see having kids have a wonderful, tremendous positive impact on happiness. Kids have mixed results on some of the other ones. We'll get back to that later on. But so our interest is then to understand how does these three dimensions link and what factors impact what. And ideally what we do is we follow large groups of people over time, not in a creepy stalker kind of way, but in a scientific kind of way, following 10,000 people over a decade to see how changes in their life circumstances impact their life satisfaction, their happiness, and so on. Because people get married, people get divorced, have kids, get promoted, get fired, and we're interested in understanding what is the average impact from these events on our happiness. For all of them, we based our analysis on subjective answers. So all of these are self-assessments. All of these are how people feel about their own lives. And I think that's the great thing about happiness research, that what we want to put at the core of what we're trying to understand is how people feel about their own lives. So Laura, who's working with me from Penguin, is actually the only one who can tell us whether Laura is happy or not. And that's what we want to give value. That's what we want to put at the core of what we're trying to understand. And I get a lot of questions, isn't it very subjective? Isn't it very difficult to measure? But I think especially journalists forget that we study a lot of things, or try to understand a lot of things that are subjective by nature. Depression, stress, anxiety, loneliness, all of those things are also about how we as individuals experience the world. So I don't see any evidence of why it should be more difficult to understand positive emotions than negative emotions. Anyways, so usually Denmark and the rest of the Nordic countries do well in the World Happiness Report. So does Switzerland, so does Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and so does Canada. Yay! Well done. And we've actually been talking a little bit today about that. I think perhaps Canada is Scandinavia of North America. I think we have some of the same values. I think we have a lot of similarities in terms of culture, in terms of our hopes and ambitions for our country. So I'll get back to that later on. But this is the 5 last World Happiness Reports. There's 155 countries in the World Happiness Report. Usually we see countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Central African Republic are at the bottom of the list. But when we look at the full spectrum of countries, we can see that the majority of the difference between all the countries can be explained with relatively few factors that explain why some countries and why some people are happier than others. And that's what the new book is about. The 6 domains, the 6 factors we can see from the data have an impact on why some people are happier than others. And what I've done is I've gone around and tried to find cases, people, places, ideas that seem to be doing things right within these 6 factors. Okay? And just to cover some of those factors here, we won't have time for all, but for a few of them, one of the factors are, no big surprise, are relationships. So do we have somebody we can rely on in times of need, yes or no? That seems to predict happiness, whether we look at very local studies or sort of the global data. So at the Institute, we've been interested in understanding how does community gardens foster a sense of community, how does mini libraries change the way we interact with our neighbors. And I think one of the most inspiring people I met in the last year is, or spoken with in the last year is Shani, who's here on the right. And Shani, she lives in Perth, Western Australia. It's an ordinary street, ordinary neighborhood, ordinary city. But she essentially has taken that street and turned it into a community. So now they have movie nights on the street. They have pizza nights. So they have this common pizza oven. They, of course, I'm not sure what this is, but it looks fun. And they have, of course, community gardens, and they also have a goat. They have a goat that sort of grasses across several lawns. I would have loved to grown up on a street with a goat. But I think what Shani did was, I mean, there were essentially three things. She used the fact that they were living on, I think it's called cul-de-sac in English, so a closed street. So it was a defined community. I think it's easier to create that sense of community when it's defined instead of a long street, because when does it end and when does it start? But then she also, one of the first things she did was she went around and she wanted to create a street directory with names and phone numbers and so on. But she also asked people about their interests, about their hobbies, about what they could give, what they needed. And one guy said, "Oh, I'd love to help people, babysit their pets." And another guy, he said, "I need people to help me eat mulberries, because in the mulberry season he had too many." And then she discovered there were 3 ladies in the street who enjoyed singing, and there was also an ex-choir mistress. So they formed the Hobart Street Choir. And that became the first thing in a series of events. But I think what she also did was that she got people to dream about what the street could be like. She said to them, "What would you like to see happen in your street? If you're not supposed to worry about who's going to do what and who is going to pay for what, but what kind of street would you like to live in?" And I think dreams are a very powerful motivator, and that sort of mobilized the street into imagining what they would like to see happen. When it comes to community and when it comes to our relationships, of course, there's also a challenge in these ones. That sometimes we are not really present where we are actually at. So we've also looked at how do we create good conditions, or how do we use this technology in a better manner than we usually do. And what we found was a Danish boarding school, which I think have done something really interesting in terms of creating a sense of community among the students. So what they've done is, at the beginning of the semester, when the students arrive, they confiscate all the devices, all the phones, all the iPads, and so on. And then the kids can have them 1 hour per day to Snapchat as crazy as they want. And then after 6 months, it's put to a vote among the students. Should we continue with this system, where you have your phones 1 hour per day, or should everybody get their phone back? And 80% of the students vote to keep the system in place, because they experience, well, if none of us have our phone, we actually create a community with each other. So I think that's interesting to observe, and I think it's interesting to see streets coming together and deciding on Fridays, none of our kids are allowed to play with their devices, and they actually go out and play on the street, potentially with their goats, like I used to do when I was growing up. So we can also see, no big surprise, health is a factor. If you are sick, you are less happy. You could say that even before happiness research pointed that out. But we're interested in understanding, how do we create good conditions for people, for example, to exercise more. So we've been interested in understanding, this graph shows the amount of people who exercise more than 5 hours per week in Europe. We have Turkey and Romania at the bottom, and we have Norway and Denmark at the top. This is one of the reasons why Danes are not as obese as we're supposed to be, because we gobble down a lot of Danish pastries. Of course, we just call them pastries. We drink, we smoke, we eat fatty foods, we eat pastries, but obesity levels are actually relatively low, in part because there's a high level of exercise, and it's not because we enjoy the gym, it's just because exercise is built into the daily routine. So the majority of people living in Copenhagen, they cycle to work, they cycle to university. even the majority of members of parliament, they cycle to parliament. We don't do it because it keeps us healthy. We don't do it because it's good for the environment. We just do it because it's easy. It's convenient. So there's been a lot of investment in creating a cycle-friendly, a pedestrian-friendly infrastructure in Copenhagen. So that's why we have a lot of exercise in our daily routine. Of course, we can't all necessarily cycle to work. But what I do is I walk up this building once a week, not in a sort of literary sense, but what I do is at the Happiness Research Institute, we have a cafe at the bottom, and when I order a cup of coffee, instead of waiting for the coffee to be ready, I go up the 4 floors and back down. And over a week, that accumulates to the Empire State Building. And yes, I do drink a lot of coffee, but it's also a nice way just to build in some micro-exercise. Also, when it comes to health and happiness, I think this graph is really interesting. It shows the pattern we see when we're looking at the global data, the relationship between age and happiness, and the usual picture is, or pattern is that we're quite happy when we're young, and it looks like we're happier when we're old, but it's all downhill until 44. I'm headed rapidly downhill these years. And it looks like there's good news that we get happier as we get older, and I think we also do to some extent. I think one of the reasons for that is we become better at understanding what matters to us and make the right choices in what will bring us happiness and become less concerned about what everybody else thinks we should do. So I think that's great. The bad news is that we can see there's a dual relationship between happiness and health. So happiness also keeps people healthy, meaning there's a lower mortality rate among happy people, which means as we grow old, the unhappy ones die off, which increases the average of the survivors. So that's sort of the bad news in that sense. Sorry. Right. So we can also see that money does matter. Unfortunately, it's only in Hollywood movies that wealth and happiness is not linked. It is linked to some extent, but I've chosen this picture for a reason, because the mechanism here is being without money is a cause of unhappiness. We can see that when we look at the relationship between income and happiness. Here we have high income group, low income to the left. And as you can see, the big difference here is moving from low income to middle income. But going from middle income to high income, there's almost no effect on happiness. And what we're seeing here is what we call diminishing marginal utility. The more we have of something, the less pleasure we derive from it. It's the same with money. It's the same with everything else. First piece of cake, great. Piece number 5. And when we first get money, when we go from low income to middle income, we spend money on food, we spend money on housing, and we're quite good at converting wealth into well-being. If we're already making a lot of money, additional money, we spend them on Serenity dog pods and stuff that really doesn't matter, right? It's not even a particularly happy dog. So this is diminishing marginal utility. And unfortunately, we also see this at a country level. We see countries increasing their wealth, but sort of failing to convert that into well-being. So this is South Korea. This is Seoul around 1960. I was there in November. Now it looks like this. So they've achieved a massive achievement in terms of creating wealth, in terms of improving GDP, gone from one of the poorest countries to one of the richest countries. But they have really struggled with converting that into quality of life. There is a non-existent work-life balance. There's the highest suicide level in OECD, in the developed countries. And they're just really, really struggling with converting wealth into well-being. So I think that the poster child of that feeling a lot of us are having, that we've gotten richer without getting happier. Part of the reason for that is that diminishing marginal return, but another reason is that what we care about when it comes to income is our relative income, because we care about our position in the social hierarchy. Laura and I, we were also talking about earlier today about status anxiety and keeping up with the Joneses, and we can see that pattern quite often in happiness data. We care about how we are doing compared to everybody else. And I think it's really interesting, in South Korea, they have a saying that goes, if one cousin buys land, the other cousin gets a stomachache. And I think that's unfortunate once wealth becomes this zero-sum game that I only win if you lose, and so on. So what I like is also to focus on equality within countries and see the impact of equality on well-being. Equality among men and women, but also equality among different socioeconomic groups. So there has been a lot of studies on the negative impact of inequality on a lot of different dimensions of well-being. On crime, on mortality, on obesity rates, on teenage pregnancies. But I think one of the most interesting studies of inequality was conducted last year, I think it was, where a group of scientists have looked at a phenomenon called air rage. So you know road rage, we drive and get really mad. Air rage is when passengers engage in unruly behavior. So one passenger starts to strangle another passenger removes his pants for the entire flight for some reason. I have a 7-hour flight tomorrow. Hopefully that won't happen. But so they looked at under what circumstances do these events of air rage occur. And they looked at delays, they looked at the size of the passenger seats. And what they found was also that the design of the cabin impacted the frequency of air rage. So what they found was if there is a first-class cabin on the plane, there's a higher frequency of air rage because people are exposed to inequality. When I first heard that, I thought, it's just because it's on the long flights where you have a first-class cabin. That must be the reason. But they also looked at how do people board the plane. And essentially, you can board the plane in two ways. You can board it in the middle of the plane, and if you are on monkey class like I am, you go in, you go right. You're not exposed to the inequality. Or you can board at the beginning of the plane. And then if you're in monkey class, you can walk through first class, and you see the champagne, see the smug faces. And under those circumstances, if you board at the beginning of the plane instead of in the middle of the plane, there is a twice as high risk of air rage. And the interesting part, I thought, was also, it's not only the monkey class passengers that misbehave, it's also the first class passengers. Because being exposed to inequality in their favor makes them feel entitled. So they're more inclined to engage in antisocial behavior, or to use the scientific term, to be assholes. But I just think it's a super interesting study, and it shows again the negative effects of inequality. And I think it's also one of the reasons why I like Copenhagen and Denmark and the Nordic countries is that you can enjoy a relatively high quality of life, whether you have little money or a lot of money. So what I like is, I enjoy the green spaces of Copenhagen that are free. I enjoy that I can cycle everywhere I need to go. So if I lost my job and all my money tomorrow, my mobility is not based on my income. I own a bike, I can go anywhere I need. Also, the water in the inner harbor of Copenhagen is so clean that you can swim in it. And I can enjoy that whether I have no money or a lot of money. And fair enough, our summer lasts about 4 hours, but still those 4 hours are very cool. And I think that makes a great society, that you can enjoy a relatively high quality of life whether you are rich or poor. I think it reduces worry. I think it reduces stress. I think it reduces that competition that some other societies create. And it's also interesting to talk, especially with American journalists. They will say, how can you be happy? You have some of the highest taxes in the world. And I say to them, maybe we are happy because we have high taxes. Because we see them as an investment in quality of life. We see that as an investment in the common good. And that works in terms of creating quality of life. All right, so before I go all communist on you, freedom, we can see also a big factor. Feeling that we are able to choose the life we want to live matters. And the question is, of course, how do we measure freedom? And when you look at something like the Human Freedom Index, it looks at sort of classical freedom rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, equal inheritance rights for men and women, which are all good. But I think a lot of the freedom indexes, they forget the element of time. Are we free to spend the time as we want? Or do we have to work 50, 60, 70 hours per week to maintain a decent lifestyle? What I hear from pretty much every family that have moved from the UK or the US to Copenhagen is that they experience an increase in their quality of life purely due to a better work-life balance. That they're able to maintain a healthy family life combined with an interesting career. That is also why I think it's super interesting to see becoming a parent, being a parent, how does that impact life satisfaction? So earlier I told you kids, great in terms of purpose. In terms of life satisfaction, the first dimension, we do see mixed results. So this graph shows, for example, here, we have the US, minus 12% means that in the US, people with kids are 12% less happy than people without kids. In the other end of the spectrum, we have Portugal. In Portugal, people with kids, so here parents, are 8% more happy than non-parents. And it's not that the American kids are worse than the Portuguese parents, it's just that their circumstances are different. What you'll see is that Sweden, Norway, Finland, to a lesser degree Denmark, but the other Scandinavian countries, here parents are happier than non-parents because there are better conditions for work-life balance. There's better infrastructure for families, there's subsidized childcare, there's reduced working hours that allows parents to be with their kids. That's why we see this picture. The reason why Portugal, Spain, those parents are happier is that they are better at using the grandparent generation, essentially. They are better at saying, listen, we're actually 6 adults that can take care of this kid instead of just being the 2 of us that have to make it all work. Of course, it would be interesting to look at what is the effect on grandparents in these countries. Would we rather just go and play golf? That's a different perspective. But I think it's super interesting to see what are the impact on life satisfaction from different policies and different cultures on, for example, being parents. So we didn't have time to cover all, but we can also see kindness, level of trust, and matters for happiness levels. And actually, just a few words on trust. That is also a difficult element to measure. How do you measure trust? And sometimes we just go around, ask people, do you feel that most strangers can be trusted, or can't you become too careful when it comes to strangers? And that gives us some idea. We can also measure trustworthiness, and that is done by going around cities with wallets containing a day's worth of pay and ID papers, and then dropping them on the streets and then seeing how many of the wallets are returned with the money intact. And a lot of studies have been done in this field in Europe and also in North America. And I also saw there was an interesting study in this field in Canada. Beyond just dropping the wallets and seeing how many of the wallets were returned, they also asked people, how many wallets do you think will be returned? To see whether there was a trustworthiness gap. And actually they found that a lot fewer people, or people expected a lot fewer wallets to be returned that was actually returned. So in Toronto, which I think was where the study was conducted, 16 out of the 20 wallets were returned with the money intact, which I think is wonderful. But anyways, so these are the 6 factors we cover in the book. We also know that we haven't found all the great cases, so we encourage people to photograph, write, talk about if they see things that seem to be doing, or people that are doing things right within these 6 factors. Show us good conditions for good lives, things that are improving quality of life for people around the world. We would love to hear about that. So please hashtag look for Lykke if you see something you would like to share with us. So those were the prepared words. We have some time for questions now. I think we have Nancy with a microphone if there is any questions. Oh. Or not. Yeah. Right. The rural-urban divide. What we see, and you actually have some great data on that in Canada, some very fine-grained data. What we see in Canada and the UK and Denmark is the same pattern, that people in the rural areas usually report higher levels of life satisfaction. So as far as I remember, it was Vancouver and Toronto that had the lowest levels of life satisfaction in the Canadian study. The question is why? And there are several explanations for that. One is that the conditions for a good life is better in the rural areas. Housing prices might be lower, lower levels of stress, different spectrum of social comparisons, stronger community, many good reasons. Another explanation could be that it might be random where we are born, but it's not random where we choose to live. And the kind of people who are attracted to city life are a different breed than the ones that are attracted to a country life. I think it's easy to speculate that people moving to the cities are perhaps, in terms of education, in terms of income, more ambitious, and that the sort of drawback to being ambitious is to be chronically dissatisfied with the status quo. So perhaps that's why we see lower levels of happiness. Ideally, what we need to do is we need to take 1,000 people from Copenhagen and drop them into the countryside, and then take 1,000 people from there and put them into Copenhagen. But the government say I can't do that. But that's ideally what we need to do. Yes?
I'm curious how this talk went over in Seoul. When you went there, were you giving the same talk, and how was it received?
I've spoken to a lot of people from South Korea, and I think the good news from South Korea is actually that they know they have trouble. They know they have a big challenge. It's the country we get most visits from at the Happiness Research Institute. Reporters, politicians, researchers, mayors. And there's one reporter or editor said to me, earlier we've been looking, we as in Koreans, we've been looking at the US as the big role model. That's where we wanted to go. Now we're looking at the US and thinking, And he, together with another delegation of journalists, were touring the Nordic countries to find inspiration of different ways of doing things. So I think that's encouraging. They know they have massive issues with quality of life. They know they have issues with a lot of pressure for the young generation. Recently, they put in a national policy that forbids parents to homeschool their kids after 10 o'clock. There is one of the biggest challenges that is difficult to address also in the conversations I've had with politicians is there's a massive stigma around mental health. When you look at the consumption of antidepressants at a country level, South Korea has the second least biggest consumption. It's not because people are not depressed, but it's because they are not seeking treatment. And that's a major issue and is part of the reason why they have the high suicide rates, that you have tremendous pressure on people, you have tremendous competition, and you don't have a mental health security or sort of safety net that picks up the pieces. The good news is that it is slowly changing. I think one of the most inspiring people I met in the past few years is a young man, South Korean, who lost his mother to suicide and is right now trying to remove the stigma around mental illness in South Korea and has established a foundation that has that aim. So things are happening. They're just not happening as fast as we would like them. But I think that's actually a challenge that all the countries are not good enough to be dealing with. There are some good things happening in that area. I see more and more sort of role models coming forward talking about mental health. Recently, you had one of the members of the royal family in the UK coming forward talking about mental illness. And I think we need more of that to sort of normalize the conversation around that. Now I forget what the question was, but South Korea, well, yeah, so, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So recently there's been a lot of talk about basic income, and I know at MIT they're also looking at redefining capitalism, all of that. Have you done any work in that arena?
No, we haven't, but I would really like to partner up with Finland. They are now doing some experiments with universal basic income. My guess would be that it would have a positive impact on well-being for several reasons. I mean, when we follow people over time, what we can see is losing your job is one of the worst things that can happen because you not only lose your income, but you also lose your identity. And a lot of us, our social circles are built up around our colleagues and our clients and so on. So that's three things people lose when they become unemployed. What we can also see is when we look at suicide rates, when it comes to unemployment, that's a driver. But we can see that if you have two areas, one area, there's low unemployment, another area, there's high unemployment. The risk of suicide is higher in this area, even though it's easier to find a job because of the low unemployment, but there's also a bigger stigma around being unemployed here, because you're the only one unemployed. Whereas if the rest, is 40% is unemployed, then that's normal. So, and hopefully that's one of the things universal basic income could move the needle on. So I'm really encouraged to see the initiatives and the experiments being conducted, but it's not something we are currently looking into now. Okay, do you want to
run with the mic?
Choose? Yeah.
I was just going to ask, not very articulately, about how you as a scientist gather data, and does that data come from people who might be happiness deficient because of depression versus people that are simply low happiness, just having an off day, a blue day, or what have you?
So, I mean, we collect data in several ways. This month we have published 2 reports, 2 studies. One was a study for a Danish foundation where we've looked at how interventions for young people impact their life satisfaction. So we followed 500, I'm going to say kids, but it shows more about my age, 16 to 24-year-olds over a period of 2 years through quantitative studies, but also through qualitative interviews. We've had a psychologist talk with these kids. So that's been sort of firsthand a relatively little sample. Another study we just published is on within health. So we've looked at a disease, how a certain skin disease impact life satisfaction and a lot of different well-being dimensions for patients, and have had 120,000 patients from across the world answer the same questions to see how less happy are people with this disease in different countries, and looking at the happiness gap, and also seeing that women are more impacted from this disease than men, that where on the body you have this disease also impacts happiness in a different way. If you have it on the scalp, it's a minor thing. If you have it on the face, on the genitals, it's a bigger thing. So that has been through surveys. So yeah, that's the data we collect sort of in different studies. I don't distinguish between whether people have sort of depression or just an off day. We capture both things, I would say, if we apply the 3 different dimensions of well-being. I can see then that, Susan, well, on Mondays, her affective dimension is really low, but, her life satisfaction is quite high. But then I can also see that there are some people who are just constantly low on life satisfaction and sense of purpose, where their mood might change. So yeah, I think we collect data that covers both those cases. Yeah.
So these days, everybody's on things like Twitter and Instagram and other social media platforms, and they spend a lot of time looking at information that can really directly show the inequality, not just between themselves and people they don't know, like celebrities, but even their immediate peers. And this has been growing for the last 10 years, but has social media, it obviously has impacted us in a great way, but has it been in a positive or negative way in terms of like your research of happiness?
I think there are positive and negative things to say about it. I think there are good things to say about social media. It does connect us with people across distances and across generations. What we've done at the Institute is conduct an experiment looking at, so we had 1,100 people in the experiment and had randomized them into 2 groups and did tests before and after the intervention, and the trial group went without Facebook for a week. And honestly, when we started the study, I didn't think we would see any effect because it was just a week. And if we assume that being exposed to Instagram and to Facebook distorts our perception of reality, that's an effect that accumulates over time. So just being without Facebook for a week, I don't think it would matter. But we did see a significant effect on many of the different indicators of life satisfaction and quality of life we looked at. I think the issue here, as you rightly say, it's that Facebook and Instagram is this constant bombardment of great news that happens for everybody else. So when I log on to Instagram, my friends are running Ironmans and getting married on the same day. And it's a really tough contrast to compare your life up against. But I think we know this. I think there's also been a study, where I think 76% of people said that they think that other people project themselves in a very sort of rosy light on Instagram. They also said that, no, I don't do that. It's the other people. But I think there is an awareness of that. I think we are also aware of the negative impacts we have, or it has on us, yet we fail to change our behavior in that sense. And also interesting, I think all the people that went into our experiment and had this experience, I assume they're all back on Facebook. And I think that's a constant battle we have. The choice between instant gratification and long-term goals or long-term purpose. I think that's the challenge we wake up with every morning, and every time we sit with this as well, myself included. I have no good ideas on how to overcome that. I think there is some inspiration in the boarding school, the families, finding out how do we use this technology that is here to stay in a better fashion. I think it's still a young technology for us to deal with. I think we still need to figure out how to use this in a better fashion. I don't think we're there yet, but I think some of the boarding schools, some of the families, some of the streets are doing things right in that sense.
Are we all equally born with the same amount of potential happiness? Like, is there a happiness gene?
Is there a happiness gene? Yeah, so we know that genetics matter. So at the University of Minnesota, they have a big, wonderful twin register, also from a time within the US history where it was allowed for a set of twins to be adopted by different parents. So you have, scientific gold, you have identical genetic material that are brought up under different circumstances. There's been a study on the well-being levels among the twins, and what they see is that non-identical twins, there's no correlation among the happiness levels. But among the identical twins, there is a correlation of 0.5, which is medium strong, between identical twins. So despite the fact that they might have different circumstances in life, one is employed, one is unemployed, one is married, one is divorced, the happiness levels are fairly similar. So yes, genetics matter, and so does it for other aspects of our mental health. Depression, schizophrenia, there are also a genetic component there. So yes, there's also one for happiness. But I think we should probably look at happiness the same way we look at health, because there's also a genetic element to health. Your longevity is also based on your genes. We're predisposed to some diseases. Secondly, your longevity or your health also depends on the healthcare in Canada, affordability, availability, level of air pollution in Vancouver. And thirdly, then the choices you make. Do you smoke? Do you drink? Diet? Do you exercise? So those three categories, I think, are quite useful also to look at happiness at. Yes, there is a genetic component. Yes, we are born more or less happy. And yes, there is a political component. The policies we live under, the cities we live in, matter in terms of our behavior and matters in terms of how we feel about our lives. And then the behavior you have also impact your well-being levels. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.